Okay, welcome everyone. I hope this is working. I see myself with a huge delay, but that's okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you could all join us to our Hammond Lecture that this year, of course, had to go virtual. So the Hammond Lecture series actually began in the year 2000 in honor of Kenneth Hammond, but our director, Professor John Borland, who I will eventually hand over, he will talk more about the importance of our Hammond Lecture series later on. But this year, it's actually our pleasure to really offer that in conjunction with the One Health Institute. And the speakers later on will actually draw your attention as to what the importance is of the links between One Health and environmental science. And then it hopefully should make sense as to why we are partnering with the One Health Institute for this year's Hammond Lecture. My name is Simone Harry, and I'm the Communications Manager and a lecturer at the School of Environmental Sciences. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this year's Hammond Lecture. But first, I wanted to acknowledge the land we are on, and so it's with great respect that we acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Adawandran people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbours have with this land. We recognize that for this gathering, you might attend from various different places that are home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And acknowledging them reminds us of our relationship to this land, where we explore, share, discuss, and learn our shared responsibility for human, animal, and environmental health. I do have to remind you that today's lecture is going to be recorded. The recording will later be posted to our YouTube channels so that you get a chance to rewatch it, or if you haven't had the chance to attend, or if you are uncomfortable with attending a live event that is recorded, you can also watch the recording later. And a way to get in contact with us and also to find out where you can access the recording is by going to our website, so the School of Environmental Sciences website, which you can see here on the screen, which is ses.uoguelph.ca. You can also reach us if you have any further questions that didn't get answered in this event at the email displayed. And you're also very welcome to follow us on our Twitter account. And similarly, we also have the One Health Institute that you can contact if you have any further questions or if you're just interested and intrigued by what you are hearing today. And their website is pointuoguelph.ca, and you can see their email and their Twitter on the screen right now. The other thing I wanted to quickly draw your attention to is with this live event, there is a way that you can access closed captioning. So if I show you here, this is how it should look like from your side. And this red arrow points to the settings that you have access to. And if you click on that setting, you can choose captions. And what's going to happen is it will display live. Of course, mistakes because it's live, but it is a really good way if you need some further help with following along. The other thing that we really would like you to know is once you have that settings panel open, you can go to this little sign here on top where the red arrow is pointing. And if you click on there, that is bringing you to the chat where you can post your questions. The way this works in this live setting is that we actually get a chance to publish your questions or not, but I don't have any concerns that any one of you will post anything inappropriate. And we thought also, yeah, then you can have my questions and then ask the questions. And we thought it might be a good way to start us off and to see if you are finding that setting. If you are willing to, feel free to pop in that Q&A right now and show us or tell us where you're from, if you want, which department where you're from, when you are from the university, or if you're joining from the outside. It would be really interesting for us to see where you're from, where you're joining from, and why are you here. Just if you want, but that might be giving us a good chance to see who you are. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the director of the School of Environmental Sciences, Dr. John Warland, who will talk a little bit more about the Hammond Lecture series, and then he will also introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Karen Kidd.
Thank you, Simone. I'd like to extend the land acknowledgement, recognizing that I'm not at the University of Guelph right now. I'm in Haldeman Tract territory, the land either side of the Grand River, promised to the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee. And right now they currently have about 5% of what that original promise was. But this is also dish of one spoon territory, which I'm very pleased to acknowledge. And I want to welcome everyone to the 19th Hammond Lecture. I believe I counted that correctly, that we've been doing this for some time, and it's really evolved into a fabulous event each year. Ken Hammond initially wanted to just get this going to make sure that we were having good conversations, not just among ourselves as academics, but with the broader public around energy resources in society. And this has been an evolving conversation. Certainly, we talk less about energy and resources in the same way we did back in 2000. And the move to One Health strikes me as a really great way to think about how interdependent and interconnected different aspects of environment, energy, and society are. So this is a lovely evolution, and I think preserves Ken Hammond's legacy in a great way. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Karen Kidd to you tonight as our keynote speaker. Dr. Kidd is the Jarislowsky Chair in Environment and Health in the Department of Biology and in the School of Earth, Environment, and Society at McMaster University. She moved there in 2017 from the University of New Brunswick, where she was Canada Research Chair in Chemical Contamination and Food Webs. She's had quite an interesting career, including 6 years with fisheries and oceans in Winnipeg. And we can see that she got off to such a great start because she has her undergraduate degree from the University of Guelph in environmental toxicology. Her lab studies how municipal wastewaters, forestry, aquaculture, and agriculture affect freshwater biota and the fate of persistent contaminants in aquatic food webs. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Dr. Kidd, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides and hear me okay?
I can.
Good. Well, as long as one person can. Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to give this talk tonight. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'd like to welcome everyone online and thank you, especially for being here under such trying circumstances. Because this panel has been assembled around the One Health theme, I thought I should start off by talking a bit about what One Health is. This is a new movement that's gaining a lot of momentum internationally because we're increasingly recognizing that the health of humans, animals, and the environment is highly interconnected and interdependent. And so it's an approach that brings together experts across all of these different disciplines to tackle issues like diseases and contamination. So tonight, the panel, I'm really excited to hear the other speakers of the panel has been assembled around One Health examples. So I'll be talking about drugs in municipal wastewaters and how they affect fish health. Heather will be talking about microorganisms in human wastes and how they can affect human health. Then Paul will be talking about food production and the different environmental stresses that causes. And then Claire will be talking about how diseases in humans and wildlife are interconnected, as well as the presence of antibiotic resistance in the environment and wildlife. And because this is such a powerful approach, the One Health movement, there's institutions like the University of Guelph that have formal One Health programs. So I'm going to be focusing on wastewater effluents because it is a huge source of pollution to our surface waters. It's the largest by volume. And it's also a great example for One Health for a number of reasons. So we know that the things that we flush down the toilet or wash down the sink, some of them can end up in surface waters and impact the health of aquatic organisms. But we also know that municipal wastewaters can be used to monitor the health of humans. So for example, a lot of municipalities right now are using wastewaters to look for COVID-19 and look at outbreaks. We're also using it to look at illicit drug use in cities. Tonight I'm going to be focusing mostly around the synthetic chemicals and more specifically the drugs that are in effluents and how they're getting into our surface waters and impacting the health of aquatic organisms. But we know that these effluents are a real mix of contaminants. So nutrients, for example, bacteria, viruses in more poorly treated effluents. So there's a number of issues associated with municipal wastewater effluents. My story really starts in the toilet. It starts in your toilet and my toilet, and that's because all of the prescription drugs and over-the-counter medications that we're taking for our health and well-being, they're excreted in our urine and feces, and then we flush them down the toilet into the sewer system. Most of us are on municipal wastewater systems, so the waters go to a wastewater treatment plant. Unfortunately, these plants weren't designed to remove pharmaceuticals in the wastewaters, so many of them are resistant to breakdown, and they get discharged in the effluents where they can be found in surface waters and then cause effects in downstream organisms. So this is what I'm really focusing on tonight. And here's an example. There's lots of great work on wastewaters and their impacts across Canada, but we also have a really strong group of experts in Burlington with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And here's an example from one of their studies on the Hamilton wastewater treatment plant, and it's showing all the different pharmaceuticals and personal care products that you can find in the effluents. So this is showing you the more common ones. And they're coded by color, so the black names are all antibiotics. The yellow is an anti-seizure medication. The blues are painkillers, etc. So the key message from this slide is that there's a lot of different types of drugs that we find in wastewater effluents. So basically what we're using, we often find in those effluents, and we often find them at levels that could cause health effects downstream in the exposed organisms. So the fish are exposed to a soup of pharmaceuticals. So I mentioned some in the previous slide, but there's also things like antifungals, blood thinner medications, heart medications, blood pressure, drugs, etc., etc. So we're just starting to understand what this mixture of different drugs is and then the impacts that it can have downstream. Some of these pharmaceuticals, once they go into our rivers and lakes, they can be broken down by sunlight or by bacteria, but sometimes they're taken up into fish. So we do find them in fish tissues. We also find them in the aquatic insects that the fish eat. And something that's more recent and a bit surprising too is that when those aquatic insects leave the river, they come out as an adult, a fly that you see here, they can actually carry those drugs in their bodies, and then when they're eaten by birds, bats, and spiders, those animals get exposed to the drugs as well. So there can be a transfer of the pharmaceuticals from aquatic to terrestrial systems. And we're starting to understand the impacts that they have on fish and other aquatic life. And some of those impacts are surprising, but some of them are not. And I'll explain that shortly. But blood lipid regulators, for example, can change the lipid levels in fish. Antidepressants can affect fish behaviors as well as reproduction in clams. The diabetes medication metformin impacts reproduction in fish, and then antibiotics can affect the growth of aquatic plants and algae. And some of these responses are surprising, but some aren't, and that's because drugs are designed to work through receptors in our body. So it's like the key and lock that I've shown here. The drug is the key and the lock is the receptor that the drug works on. And I like to say that fish and humans aren't that different because fish can have some of those same receptors that we have. So when we design drugs to work through specific receptors, have specific biological responses in humans, they can also have the same kinds of responses like the blood lipid regulators have in fish. So I'm going to focus now on a more specific issue around municipal wastewaters, and this is the issue of how these wastewaters can interfere with the sexual development of fish. And this was an issue that gained a lot of attention in the late 1990s because of work out of the UK, and what they were doing is collecting fish in a lot of different rivers. They were finding that a lot of the males of this particular species, the roach, were becoming feminized. And what I mean by that is that the male fish were producing egg proteins, which you normally only see in females. And in the more severe cases, they were developing eggs. And sometimes 100% of the males in a river were feminized. So certainly this caused a lot of concern in the UK and worldwide about what it was that was causing this feminization. And initially we thought maybe it was detergents or pesticides or industrial chemicals, but some detective work focused it in on the presence of synthetic hormones like the birth control pill, the estrogen that's used in the birth control pill, and the natural hormones that we excrete that were being taken up by male fish and causing this feminization response. So the work out of the UK motivated a lot of work worldwide to look for feminized male fish. So do we have them in Canada? And yes, we do. Here's some examples. They're found in the South Saskatchewan River. They're found in Wascana Creek downstream of Regina. They're found downstream of Montreal and also closer to home in the Grand River. And the common theme for these fish is that they're small and they tend to live in a fairly local area, so their exposure to these estrogens is higher. There's also another broader common theme that a lot of these areas, there's high human populations, the wastewater isn't treated as well, and then there's less dilution in the waters that these effluents are being discharged to. So I'm going to focus in on the Grand River to give you more details about this, and this is some great work that's been done by Dr. Mark Servos at the University of Waterloo in his lab. And they've been monitoring the darters living in the Grand River upstream and downstream of wastewater discharges for years. And they were finding high numbers of feminized male fish downstream of some wastewater discharges. And this is the darter. This picture in the middle is a darter opened up, and the white tissues you see, those are the testes. And sometimes you can see the feminization very clearly just by looking at the testes, and you see these round yellow objects, those are eggs. So in this case, they found over half of the males were feminized this way. We can also look at the testes under a microscope, like you see in the picture on the left. And those larger round objects, those are eggs that are interspersed amongst the sperm cells. So there were a lot of questions arising from this kind of work, and we started a whole lake experiment in the late 1990s around the presence of estrogens in effluent. This work was done at the fantastic experimental lakes area, which was developed in the late 1960s and run mostly by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but more recently by the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And it was really established to understand the ecosystem impacts of threats to our fresh waters. So things like climate change or chemical contamination. And the results of these studies have fed into a number of policies, such as the removal of phosphates from detergents, and it's helped to develop solutions for these problems. And it's got a long history of highly impactful studies. So the questions, while we knew at the time that there were feminized male fish living in our rivers, we knew that it was being linked to the presence of estrogens in these effluents. But our million-dollar question was, well, what does that mean for the fish population? So can those fish still successfully reproduce, or is the sustainability of that population threatened? So this was why we did a whole lake experiment where we added the pill to a lake at the experimental lakes area. This is an aerial photograph of the lake that we chose for our study, called Lake 260, and we chose it because it contains this fish called the fathead minnow that you see in the picture, but it's also got a number of other fish species, including a large predator, the trout. And this was our design, and it's very similar to designs for a lot of whole lake experiments done at the experimental lakes area. So there's a few years ahead of time where you're looking at the natural state of the lake, and then there's some sort of manipulation. In our case, the addition of the birth control pill for 3 summers from 2001 to 2003. And then for several years after that, we were no longer adding the pill to the lake, and we looked at either ongoing impacts or recovery. So we were using the synthetic estrogen EE2, or phenylestradiol. It's used in the pill as well as other hormone therapies. And just to give you some context, because it's not a very persistent compound, we had to add it regularly to the lake. And we were adding about 10,500 pills of EE2 per day. And that's basically what a city of about 240,000 would be using based on the demographics of the pill use. And it was pretty easy to dose the lake. We just dissolve it into some methanol and then pump that solution into the propeller wash of the boat and drive the boat around. So it took about 15 minutes to dose the lake with EE2. So the next few slides are really about how the fathead minnow responded. So this was the main character in our story, and we focused on it because it's short-lived. It reproduces only once, so it has one kick at the can, so to speak. And it's also a very widespread species in North America and a common prey species for a lot of larger fish like trout. And it was the species in our study that responded most dramatically to the EE2 additions. So this graph is looking at the levels of egg proteins in the fathead minnow in the males from our experimental lake in the blue bars, and then 2 of our reference lakes in the gray and green bars, both before and during the EE2 additions. And you'll see the very large blue bars, those are our fish that we collected during the EE2 additions, and the first bar was just within weeks of us starting to add the EE2. So right away, the males responded and started to produce very high levels of egg proteins. We also looked at the testes of the males, and this first picture is a cross-section from a male fish taken just in the spring right before they reproduce. And all of those dots that you see in the pictures, those are sperm cells. So that's what a normal male looks like. And then this next image is a male that was exposed to EE2 for 1 season. And what we found is that the sperm cells were much more delayed, and that there was a lot of chaos in the testes, a lot of fibrotic tissues. And then in our third year of this experiment, what we saw was the presence of eggs in the males. So this similar condition to what was initially observed in the UK in the roach. And then to go to our million-dollar question, what happened to the fathead minnow population? Well, this top graph here is the number of young that we saw in the fall of each year, and the gray section there is during our EE2 edition. So it's basically showing you the catches in our experimental lake, the black diamonds, and then the catches in our reference lake, the white circles. And what we saw in our second year and for several years after is that there was a reproductive failure. So we almost had no young of the year produced in those years. And we saw a similar pattern for the adults where their numbers stayed similar for several years and then crashed in the year after our editions ended. And that's because the adults just lived out their lifespan and then died off. So these graphs basically answered that question that yes, feminized male fish can't reproduce successfully and that there's implications for the sustainability of the fish population. And we also found that the pill is as effective for fathead minnows as it is for humans. So I'm often asked, well, does this mean that women should stop taking the birth control pill? And my answer is no, that the solution to this issue is around better wastewater treatment. So these are some, I guess it's showing the level of estrogens that are removed in primary, secondary, and advanced treatment. So when you just screen the solids out of wastewater, you can remove 37% of the estrogens. Then when you upgrade to secondary treatment with bacteria, you can remove up to 85% of the estrogens. And then when you move to advanced treatment, like you have in Guelph, you can remove almost all of the estrogens in the wastewater. So there's good news. There's lots of good news around this issue. And the first is that we have new wastewater systems effluent regulations in Canada. And as a result of that, there's a lot of wastewater treatment plants that are undergoing upgrades across Canada and a huge investment, I think about $11 billion across the country to improve effluent quality. And I'll show you shortly that these upgrades benefit fish health. So even though they weren't put in place to benefit fish health, we're seeing a lot of those benefits of the improved wastewater treatment. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that in North America as well as in Europe, we're starting to re-envision wastewater. So we're seeing them less as a waste and more as a resource. And that's because they contain nutrients like phosphorus and energy and water, certainly, that we can recover from the wastes and reuse. So, and I think as we recover these resources, we're going to improve effluent quality as well. So I wanted to close my talk by showing you a good news story from Kitchener, and this is again work by Dr. Mark Servos and his group at Waterloo. And like I mentioned before, they've been monitoring the fish downstream and upstream of several wastewater treatment plants on the Grand River, and they were following fish health before and after upgrades that were done at the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant. So this is a figure showing ammonia levels before and after the upgrade, so 2013 and on. So you can see that the advanced, well, the nitrification reduced ammonia levels, improved effluent quality, and at the same time that improved treatment reduced the levels of a number of pharmaceuticals and estrogens in the effluent. So what they were also doing at the same time is looking at these feminized male darters upstream and downstream of the wastewater treatment plant. So the graph here has three different groups of bars. So the first one is the percentage of males upstream that were feminized. And then the middle group of bars is the percentage of males right downstream of the effluent discharge that were feminized. And then the last group of bars is the number of males that were feminized at a further downstream site. And all of these individual bars are different years. So you focus on the middle and the right group of bars, you can see in 2013 and years after that the incidence of intersex or incidence of feminized males declines quite rapidly. So improved effluent quality had great benefits for the fish downstream. So today I've really focused on one path of pharmaceutical release to the environment. So that's through human consumption and release in municipal wastewaters. But I wanted to mention that there's a lot of other sources of pharmaceuticals that we're concerned about and trying to understand. So their use in livestock, for livestock and pets, inappropriate disposal in landfills, their use in aquaculture, and then also their release by manufacturing facilities. So some of you may be asking, well, what can I do to help? And I'd like to give a shout out to the Health Products Stewardship Association, because there's a lot of great information on their website about how to properly dispose of unused medications. And the main message they have is that there's lots of pharmacies that will take back medications that you don't use. So just some closing thoughts from me is that we design pharmaceuticals to be biologically active and to work through receptors. And because humans and fish are not that different in some ways, the effects that they have in humans can also happen in fish. We know that the diverse suite of pharmaceuticals that we're using and releasing can be persistent in wastewater treatment and then get discharged into the environment. There's a lot of pharmaceuticals that we're using, but right now we only look at a small percentage of them. So there's a lot that we don't know in terms of what's in our environment and the impacts that it's having on aquatic life. And then we know that fish and other aquatic organisms are being continuously exposed to these drugs because effluents are continuously discharged. So there's certainly more work to be done about what kinds of effects they're having. And my last point here is that this issue really needs groups to come together. So the manufacturers, the consumers, governments, to improve how drugs are produced, used, and disposed of, and that will absolutely help reduce the presence and the impact of these drugs in surface waters. So I'll just end by saying that we've had great support from a lot of different organizations and institutions for this work that I talked about, so I'd like to thank all of them. And I'll end just by thanking you again for being here, for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Prof. Karen Kate, for this amazing talk that was very, very insightful. And your comment about questions is just leading me to the next point here. So we decided to streamline the event a little bit better. We will answer questions after all of our next 3 panelists have been given their presentation, but you are absolutely welcome to already post the questions in our question window that I showed you at the beginning. And one request that we have, that if you know when you keep listening who you would like the question to go to, if you could indicate that. But now I'm going to be hand over to our first panelist, and our first panelist today is going to be Professor Paul Sibley from the School of Environmental Sciences. And Paul will be talking about the sustainable agriculture imperative from a One Health perspective. And Paul's research there's research interest focus on issues of water quality and its management, including understanding stressor interactions and their cumulative effects, the effects of anthropogenic stressors in agriculture, boreal and Arctic landscapes, risk assessments of novel, priority and emerging compounds, and understanding risk perception. So I will hand over to Paul, and I'm hoping that you will find his presentation as insightful as Professor Kidd's.
Well, thank you, Simone. I just want to clarify, can everybody see my presentation on your screens?
Yes, I can see your slides and you.
Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you all for joining the Hammond Lecture. I'm sure Kenneth Hammond would be very excited and would fully embrace the One Health conversation that hopefully we'll engage in. And thanks to Karen for your very interesting presentation as well. My contribution to this discussion is going to focus on sustainability, which is another area that Dr. Hammond was very interested in, particularly policies related to sustainability. And I'm going to talk about agricultural sustainability from the context of, and the keyword here is imperative. I really believe that we're at a crossroads, and hopefully in the short time that I have, you'll come to understand just how imperative it is that we change the manner in which we practice agriculture. My thinking on this really originated from an exercise that my PhD student and I, Renee Shamohamadlu, went through for the better part of the first half of this year, kind of a COVID project in a sense. It was a vision that we developed and submitted as part of the Food System Vision Prize sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it's one where we put forth a vision of a food system based on what we call truly integrative agricultural practices, really the development of a framework outlining a set of practices and principles to maximize food production, minimize environmental footprints. You'll see elements of this vision in the short talk, but if you want the details, and in fact the details of many of the other visions that are available, there's about 78 of them. Some of them are just remarkable. You can go to the address or the link that you see on your screen there. So what is agriculture's environmental footprint? I think we all have some sense that agriculture has a pretty significant footprint on the landscape. You know, with respect to water use and availability, for example, 92% of water used globally is done so for agricultural purposes. That footprint's a little bit less in North America. We typically are in the 60 to 70% range, but still pretty significant. With respect to greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture accounts on a global scale for about 33% of emissions. Now, again, a lot of this is from land clearing in tropical countries to make way for agricultural land and food production. But we have a very high input carbon model here in North America as well. And so our carbon footprint, again, is also relatively high. We, of course, produce synthetic chemicals, particularly fertilizers, in order to maximize crop production, and also pesticides. I'll give a short example in a moment about harmful algal blooms and the link between agriculture and water quality, in keeping in part with some of the themes that you'll see today on the aquatic side, but also issues like pollinator declines, as has been linked to certain pesticides on the landscape and is used in agriculture. And habitat loss, this is significant. Agriculture occupies a large area from a spatial standpoint, and often it's in monocultures. They may rotate from year over year, but they're monocultures, and so we have very low diversity. And when you have that much landscape occupied as such, you tend to see declines in biodiversity and the attendant ecosystem services associated with the land that is, you know, basically doing one service, and that's producing food. And I want to kind of underscore the importance of soil health here, because that may be the single most important issue that we're facing in modern times with respect to being able to produce food in say 2050. Soil health in many areas is declining, and we need to find ways to manage that and build that back. And all of this has to be considered in the context of climate change, which affects and permeates every aspect of the footprint that agriculture already has, mostly to exacerbate rather than to mitigate. Just by way of an example, this is a typical farmscape in southwestern Ontario. These are photographs, except for the top left-hand one that I took. You can see that fertilizers are being applied, whether it's by manure or synthetic chemicals. And these can leave that landscape and enter into aquatic systems, either through runoff, perhaps you can follow my arrow there on the screen, overland or surface flow, or as kind of through direct conduits, such as in tile drains, which you see here. In either case, these materials, the fertilizers, and to some extent the pesticides, are moving into our aquatic systems and into our local streams, and ultimately into Lake Erie, which is what you see here is in this satellite image. And you see on the left-hand side the town of Toledo and the Maumee River, and it's rather famous because it contributes, depending on the year, up to 80% of the phosphorus that discharges into Lake Erie. And the resulting bloom that you see here is a direct consequence of the phosphorus and nitrogen that enters there. You can see it up here in Lake St. Clair too, and that's largely from watersheds in Ontario associated with the Thames River. This is significant, and I'll clarify this even more in the next graph, in the next slide. In 2014, this algal bloom encompassed or engulfed the water intake, which, if you can see my arrow on the screen, was right about here in Lake Erie. And for about 3 to 4 days, the water system in that entire town was shut down because of fear over toxins that might have been in the drinking water. The Army was called in, bottled water was imported, and it was a bit of a mess, and generated a lot of headlines at that time. But I think it really does encompass nicely the One Health perspective that we have to kind of bring into our consideration when we think about changing agriculture. On the one hand, as I just indicated, you have concerns about toxins and therefore human health. Anybody who owns a pet is probably aware of stories of pets dying from the ingestion of toxins from water. Livestock, similarly, there's dozens of deaths a year in Canada from livestock drinking algal toxin or toxin contaminated waters from local ponds. And of course, the environment, we don't know quite as much about how an environment will respond to this. Bear in mind, these are naturally occurring organisms, as are the toxins, so they're present, but we're exacerbating that situation and making it worse. And these blooms are more intense and more frequent. How does that affect the ecosystem? We're even thinking about things like fish consumption advisories specific to algal toxins, and that's some of the work that some of my students have been looking at. So we know that agriculture has a significant impact on the landscape, whether it's soil, terrestrial, or aquatic. But how do we address the problem going forward? By the year 2050, for example, the world's population is going to be, depending on the model that you look at, somewhere around 10 billion. 9.7 billion is the number I see most frequently stated. And food production is going to need to increase by more than about 50% of 2012 production levels to meet the demands of feeding that population. And bear in mind, we already do a very poor job of feeding the world's population, where as many as 60% of the world are food insecure. This really presents a conundrum. Industrial agriculture is a leading contributor, as we know, and as I've just kind of shown with one example, to environmental degradation on a global scale. And yet we need to produce more food at a time when available land, soil health, and economic viability are declining, among other factors as well. And maybe we can some of those as we move into the discussion section. So the thing that I've seen more and more, and which is coming up in literature, is this case for sustainable intensification, a process or system where yields are increased without adverse or with minimal additional adverse environmental impact, and importantly, without the cultivation of more land. So don't use more land to produce more food, intensify the production of food on the land that you have. And it reduces reliance on the use of external inputs, such as nutrients and chemicals, for regulating and supporting ecosystem services. In other words, the land itself generates those services or the nutrients that we need and the controls that we need, rather than relying on externalities. Sustainable intensification is a very controversial term because a lot of people believe that this is really just business as usual. but it's not, and I'll kind of show that in a moment. We're really at a make or break point for this planet. And here I'm quoting Ruben Echeverria, who's the chair of the Commission on Sustainable Agriculture Intensification. As I noted, we need to produce more nutritious and healthy food. This was very much at the core of the Food Vision Prize that we submitted to, while at the same time reversing environmental degradation, malnutrition, and poverty that have resulted from the business as usual scenario. So this graphic, this is very timely because as I was putting together this talk, I came across this particular graph. It's published by Leclerc now in Nature, and it came out just a couple of weeks ago. And the premise of the work was that biodiversity is fundamental to food security. Why is that? Well, it is the case for many reasons, but if you're going to build back, you're going to turn from external sources to create plant growth and move toward internal sources. Biodiversity is the way to do it because it's the microbial communities in soil, for example, that are going to build back the organic material that you need in order to produce healthy plants and nutritious plants. So this was really interesting to me. And what they did was they used 4 different models to evaluate, and you might be able to see my arrow on here, several different scenarios. And I'm going to try and summarize this very quickly because it's a detailed map. The business as usual scenario in gray here is this line here. So we just continue to do what we do. We will see biodiversity decline relative to values in 2010. So that's the gray bar here. If we start manipulating or modeling based on increased supply or decreased demand, that is, we use less food or supply more food, we can alter that incrementally. We can improve. So there are changes to the system now without thinking about other aspects that we can use in order to improve our biodiversity. If you start thinking about conservation measures, you get into issues like land sharing versus land sparing, etc., land setbacks, pollinator rows, etc., etc. These conservation measures, as indicated by the green line, can improve biodiversity. And bear in mind, this is all projected out toward 2100, so this is a long time down the road. Where we really get the biggest bang for our buck, though, is in these combinatorial scenarios, where you have conservation plus a supply side or a demand side, or ultimately all of these. This is where you start to see the greatest benefit with respect to building back that biodiversity into landscapes, to create a more resilient landscape that can withstand the vagaries, for example, of climate change and so on. Just one example among many. You choose this one because, as you can see, here's your One Health concept here: humans, environment, and animals, is regenerative agriculture. This is an integrated system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soil by rebuilding back the organic matter. So there, I've referred to that a second time, and that's critical to restoring soil health and restoring soil biodiversity. That's linked, of course, to the organic matter, and enhances the ecosystem services, and again reverses climate change effects, so more resilient landscapes. And the one thing I thought, I like this particular graphic because it incorporates, and I'll get into this in the next slide, the idea that we have to be concerned not just about the environment. Of course that's important, soil health, water, and biodiversity, but in the true context of One Health, we need economic resiliency in farming communities, as well as concerns and issues related to animal well-being and health as well. So, but there are other aspects, and maybe we can get into some of that in the end. So just to kind of finish up here, the whole idea that I'm really driving toward here is that we need to build resilient agro-systems. This is not an agro-ecosystem, this is an agro-system, inclusive of and recognizing the fact that food has to be produced with environmental, economical, cultural, nutritional, and animal welfare considerations at its core, because these are all intimately connected. And although you can't necessarily resolve what's in this particular graphic, this is something we submitted as part of our vision, and it demonstrates the intimate relationships that exist around building in these resilient agro-systems. So I'll just leave with this rather provocative quote from Jane Goodall in a recent interview with The Guardian. I'm not sure I agree about humanity being finished, but it does really speak to the fact that these are the sorts of, this is the sort of dialogue, the narrative that exists out there that the public is seeing, and that really speaks to the need to establish a more sustainable agricultural approach. In other words, it is imperative that we do that. And through all of this, of course, the One Health perspective can be very informative and should be an intimate component of our move toward a more sustainable agricultural approach. So with that, with that quote, I'll leave it to I guess back to Simone.
Yes. Thank you very much, Paul.
I think it stops there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So again, we encourage you to put your questions in the questions panel, and we will get to your questions at the very end. And please indicate, if you do know who the question is for, who you would like the question to be for. And our next panelist is Dr. Heather Murphy, who will be talking about wastes, water, and infrastructure. What bugs are in our water? And Dr. Heather Murphy obtained her PhD in environmental engineering here at the University of Guelph in 2010. She recently joined the Department of Pathobiology, also here at the University of Guelph, as an associate professor in the theme of One Health. So Dr. Murphy is very specialized in the One Health topic. And so that's why she's a great panelist to have. There are other reasons, but that's one of them. And prior to joining Guelph, she spent 5 years at Temple University in Philadelphia in their College of Public Health. And she leads the Water Health and Applied Microbiology Lab. Her research has primarily focused on microbial quality of water and public health. And with this, I will hand over to Dr. Murphy.
Thanks, Simone. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes, I can see your slides and I can hear you and see you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here and I'm really honored to be part of this panel with distinguished panelists. I also just recently moved to Guelph in September 1st, so I'm a new member of the college. And so you'll have to excuse me, some of the slides I'm going to talk about today are from the work I did when I was in Philadelphia. So the title of my talk is Waste, Water, and Infrastructure, What Bugs Are in Our Water. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a little bit about what pathogens we find that are excreted by animals and how they make their way through the environment into our water supplies. And the same thing about human pathogens that make their way from our wastewater through the environment into water supplies, and the infrastructure involved in the conveyance of our wastewater and how that is failing and it's aging, and now this is compounding into effects on public health. So when I say bugs, what do I mean by that? I mean pathogens, and certain pathogens that we're most concerned with in water belong to 3 different groups. So we have viruses, bacteria, and protozoa. The viruses are quite small. They're smaller than bacteria, and bacteria are smaller than protozoa. Viruses are more infectious, meaning it takes fewer viruses for someone to get sick. An example of a virus that can be found in water is norovirus. Bacteria are larger than viruses. Some examples that you may have heard of is Salmonella, Campylobacter. And then protozoa are the largest of the 3, and they can actually be quite resistant to chlorine and different types of treatment technologies. And 2 that you've maybe heard of as well that are waterborne are Cryptosporidium and Giardia. Now today I'm going to focus on 2 major types of water supplies. One is urban recreation. So in a lot of waterways, people like to swim, fish, wade, boat, and you see that on the Great Lakes, and you see that also in urban water bodies, I guess, across Europe and in North America. I'm also going to talk about rural water use and consumption, predominantly looking at private wells and the impact that human and animal waste can have on private water supplies. So with the urban context, we're focused on human wastewater. So that's a picture at the top of a combined sewer overflow where human raw wastewater is being discharged into the environment. The bottom picture is from Lake Ontario and showing discharge of raw wastewater. The other things we're also concerned with are animals who excrete pathogens that can be harmful to human health. So we have waterfowl and horses and different types of animals that you can see in the environment that can excrete pathogens. When it comes to urban infrastructure, what we're concerned with and where this raw wastewater is getting discharged into our water bodies is from combined sewer overflows. And for those who are not familiar with a combined sewer system, these systems are old infrastructure that exist across Europe and North America, where they were originally designed to capture the rainwater that we get on our streets and have it overflow directly into waterways, as opposed to being directed to the wastewater treatment plant. And the idea was not to overwhelm the treatment plant so it wasn't able to process all the wastewater, so instead it would be overflowed. But as a result, this water mixes with sewage or human wastewater, and then as a result you're discharging raw sewage into the waterways. Now this is a picture from a combined sewer overflow system in Philadelphia. And then this is a map of the city of Philadelphia, and all of those blue dots that you see represent a combined sewer outfall. And those are on local creeks and rivers where people do recreate, although it is technically illegal to do so. We find lots of populations do. And there's around 150 combined sewer overflows in the city of Philadelphia. So what does this mean for public health? Well, in 2017, 270 million meters cubed of untreated sewage was discharged into Canadian waterways. So we have equally as big of a problem in Canada as in the US. And this is a picture of a do not swim warning in Lake Ontario in the city of Toronto. We don't have these estimates for Canada, but in 2001, the United States Environmental Protection Agency estimated that between 1.8 to 3.5 million people become sick annually due to recreational contact with waters contaminated by sewer overflows. And this is actually a photo of two children from this summer swimming, or I guess wading, into Coney Creek, which is one of the creeks in Philadelphia that is heavily impacted by combined sewer overflows. So how risky is it to swim in these waterways? Well, in Philadelphia, we found the following pathogens in local creeks. So we found norovirus, adenovirus, salmonella, enterohemorrhagic E. coli. We also have detected in the past cryptosporidium and giardia in other studies. And the predicted health risks, based on some work that my PhD student Shannon McGinnis did, showed that the risk of swimming in these waterways exceeds the United States Environmental Protection Agency guideline of 30 illnesses per 1,000 recreational events. And in terms of Canadian guidelines, the Canadian guidelines are more stringent. They're kind of the acceptable risk is between 10 and 20 illnesses per 1,000 events. And so in these waterways, we would be far exceeding those risks. Moving to rural contexts and protection of private water supplies, we have two major sources of contamination. One is feces from human septic systems that are getting transported into the environment. Septic systems, for those who aren't familiar, are not really designed for the reduction of pathogens, and they actually will only remove roughly 60%, if that at best. And then they rely on the soil environment to provide some additional removal. But in some areas you have fractures in the rock, therefore it provides conduits for these organisms to make their way directly into the groundwater. The same can happen with fecal waste from animals that can be deposited on land or land application for manure, and you have runoff during a rainfall. That runoff can then get transported into the groundwater through cracks in the casing of the wells or through just natural percolation down through the soil and in through fractures in the rock. So here's some examples of some of this infrastructure failing in Pennsylvania. So we were conducting some dye tracer studies where essentially we pour a pile of fluorescent dye down someone's toilet, and then we want to see if that dye shows up in their groundwater supply. But in this case of this one household, the green dye was actually coming out the back of their septic system into a local creek. And so this is what the dye looked like when we took a sample, and then about 1.5 kilometers downstream, you can see how green this creek is, and this was actually a waterway being used for recreation. So this is an example of not only groundwater potentially being contaminated, but also the surface water from septic systems. So what are some of the impacts on rural water supplies? I'm going to explain one study that we did. We monitored 5 wells between 2016 and 2017, and we took 105 samples over time. And you may wonder why only monitor 5 wells. It doesn't seem like very many, but instead of monitoring, say, 100 wells one time, we really wanted to know what was happening over time. So what was the temporal variability of the well water quality? And what we were interested in looking at was really, are septic systems the cause of contamination in private wells? And is it the household's own septic system that is the culprit? So we were looking for human sewage markers. And so we collected our samples and used a method called dead-end ultrafiltration, which basically we take these filters and concentrate large volumes of water and then look at the DNA of our sample to see if we can detect certain bacteria and pathogens. And what we found is that we detected this human sewage marker consistently in all of these wells over time. And it's called human bacteroides. It's a bacteria unique to the human gut and can be found in abundance in human feces. So we knew that these wells were being impacted by septic systems. Now, we weren't sure if it was the household's own septic system or maybe their neighbors. So we also conducted some dye tracer studies. In addition, we looked at the impact of rainfall, and rainfall impacted when we detected the human bacteroides. So when we conducted these dye tracer studies, we ran them on 3 of our 5 wells, and in all cases, we detected the dye that we dumped down the toilet in the household's well water supply. And so as a result, showing there was a connection between the household's septic system and their well. So what do we think the health risk is associated with private groundwater supplies? Well, in Canada, from some work I did with the Public Health Agency of Canada several years ago, we estimated that around 70,000 cases of acute gastrointestinal illness per year could be occurring from people drinking water from private groundwater wells. In the United States, if we take that estimate, it increases to about 1.3 million cases per year, or 4.1 billion in lost healthcare and productivity costs. And then globally, a very crude estimate would be between 35 and 60 million cases of AGI per year. But really, we don't know until we conduct an epidemiological study to look at it in more detail. And so I've been talking about a lot of problems, and I want to leave you with one possible solution, and one is possibly the treatment of private well water. And we were recently awarded funding by the National Institutes of Health in the United States to conduct a trial that we're calling the WET trial. And we're looking at whether UV water treatment of well water can reduce illness in children under the age of 5. And it's being run similar to a drug trial for those who are not familiar with randomized controlled trials. So essentially, we're going to recruit 908 households in 6 different counties in rural Pennsylvania, and they will be enrolled in our study for 12 months. Half of these households will get assigned a UV water treatment device, and half will get assigned an identical UV water treatment device, but it will be inactive. So the household will not know that they have an active or inactive device. After that, we will follow the children for 12 months, and we will ask about symptoms of illness, looking at acute gastrointestinal illnesses and respiratory illnesses that can be caused by the pathogens we expect to find in the groundwater. Additionally, we will collect stool and saliva samples to see what pathogens children have been infected with, as well as water samples. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the different funders of the work that I've presented, and a lot of Temple University students and research fellows have contributed to all the data collection. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Simone, and I look forward to your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Murphy. I already see some excellent questions in the chat, so keep them coming. We have one more panelist that will talk to all of us tonight, and that's Dr. Claire Jardine, who will talk about how wildlife health fits into One Health. And Dr. Claire Jardine is an associate professor at the Department of Pathobiology, so the same department as Dr. Heather Murphy is in here at the University of Guelph. And she is also the regional director of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative for Ontario and Nunavut. Her research is focused on investigating the ecology of multi-host pathogens in wildlife populations. So quite another twist, but it's exciting to see all of the different facets that One Health has. And so I will hand over to Dr. Jardine.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to make sure, can you hear me and see the slides okay?
Yes, I can see your slides, I can hear you and see you.
Wonderful, thank you, Simon. Wow, I am learning a lot here today, and I'm really delighted to be here as a member of the panel for the Hammond Lecture. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, if my slides will go, the role of wildlife in this One Health triad. And in my role as regional director for the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, our team sometimes gets called to investigate disease outbreaks in wildlife. And when we do that, there's often a lot of concern about transmission of diseases from wildlife to humans. So these two components of the triad that are outlined in red here. And I wanted to just talk about one example of that. This was an outbreak that we investigated, and you can see here there's a very concerned daycare worker, and she's pointing towards the ground. And what she's pointing at is this. So there's a lot of dead bats, and you can see some of them are out, but they shouldn't be because it's snowing, or there's snow on the ground, and there's some dead and sick bats in the environment there. And what the daycare was really concerned about is they wanted to know if those bats have some sort of infection that can make the children that she's responsible for or herself sick. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Of course, we'd all be concerned for that. We're living in a time of increased disease emergence. This picture here shows some examples of diseases that have emerged since the 1980s. Not all originate in wildlife, but many do, including some like hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, Ebola, West Nile, and Powassan, just to name a few. In fact, it's estimated that approximately 70% of emerging human infectious diseases originate in wildlife. And you'll note that this figure doesn't yet include the COVID-19 pandemic, but that will certainly be added to this figure, and it'll be yet another example of an emerging disease with its origin in wildlife. And of course, when we're faced with these threats, our immediate priority has to be controlling and managing disease in humans. But it's also important to think about that third component of the triad, the environment. And we know that there are common anthropogenic drivers of disease threats to both wildlife and human health. And these include habitat destruction, encroachment of humans into wildlife habitat, and the human-assisted spread of pathogens. In fact, ecosystem change is thought to be the most significant driver of emerging diseases. So we really ignore this environmental health component at our peril. And what I want to talk to you today about is a little bit about how wildlife kind of fit in there. I think that understanding the role of wildlife in the epidemiology of infectious diseases and how the environment affects disease dynamics is really crucial for developing effective prevention and control strategies for different infectious diseases now and in the future. So my students and I work on a variety of different pathogen host systems, and one that I think sort of complements some of the work that the other speakers talked about today is our work on enteric pathogens like Salmonella, which Dr. Murphy mentioned, and antimicrobial resistance. And I'll refer to that sometimes as AMR for short. So as Dr. Murphy mentioned, Salmonella, it's one of the bacterial pathogens. It's one of the most important causes of foodborne illness in Canada. Antimicrobial resistance can occur in Salmonella, but it can occur in a variety of different pathogens. And it occurs when microorganisms survive and grow in the presence of antimicrobial drugs, so that the microorganisms can no longer respond to the drugs that were designed to control them. So antimicrobial resistance is a global public health threat that limits our ability to treat common infectious diseases and can result in prolonged illness, disability, and death. And we tend to think about AMR as a problem that affects human health primarily. And we know that the use of antimicrobials in human and animal settings leads to the development of resistance. So you may be kind of wondering how wildlife even fit in here. They don't typically get given antimicrobials, and they don't show up in this diagram here as a component of the spread of resistance. But we've seen from Dr. Kidd and Dr. Murphy how antibiotics and pathogens can spread into the environment associated with livestock and humans. And we wanted to look at AMR and salmonella in wildlife living in different environments in Ontario and see how big an issue it was here. And we predicted that it would probably be a bigger issue on farm sites compared to other environments. And we started this project by trapping wild small mammals living in residential areas, landfill sites, conservation areas, and on farms. We collected fecal samples from these animals, and we cultured E. coli from their feces. And then we tested the E. coli for resistance to different antimicrobials that are commonly used in human medicine. And this work was done by Dr. Samantha Allen as part of her MSc research. Now, we specifically targeted small mammals like this deer mouse here, meadow vole, and redback vole, because they have small home ranges, and what we found in their feces we felt would reflect what was in their immediate environment. And we did in fact find a higher prevalence of antimicrobial resistance in the feces of animals on farms, about 48%, compared to all the other areas. But it is interesting that we did find antimicrobial resistance in all these different environments. And one of the most interesting findings of our study is highlighted here in this red box. So the category 1 antimicrobials are of the greatest importance to human health. And you can see here that the percentage of isolates that were resistant didn't significantly differ between residential areas and farm sites. So this suggests that there are other sources for AMR in wildlife besides agriculture. So we also investigated salmonella and antimicrobial resistance in larger species of wildlife, including raccoons. And these animals are interesting because they have the ability to move larger distances and between different environments. And this work was done by Dr. Kristen Bondo as part of her PhD. And I'm just going to show you some of the results of the work she did on salmonella in raccoons. And for this project, we added soil as an environmental sample. So here are some of the results. We isolated salmonella from about 5% of soil samples, both on farm sites and in conservation areas, and about 27% of raccoon fecal samples on conservation sites, and 23% of raccoon fecal samples on farms. So in this case, we detected salmonella in raccoons and environmental samples in both environments, suggesting that salmonella might be quite widespread in the environment. We were also interested in determining if raccoons were maintaining salmonella or if they were just picking it up from the environment. And one of the ways we looked at this was to look and see if the serotypes of salmonella in the raccoons changed over time. In this table here, each line represents a different individual animal and their salmonella status over time. And you can see, for example, for individual 504, and most other individuals, they were colonized with different types of salmonella each time they were sample positive. And this suggests to us that raccoons are unlikely to be maintaining this kind of long-term colonization with these bacteria without re-exposure from the environment. So even though raccoons may not be important in maintaining salmonella over the long term, there's still the potential for them to spread salmonella or antimicrobial resistance to new areas or to act as sources of infection for other animals or humans. And this has important implications for how we try to control salmonella and antimicrobial resistance. On-farm control can be challenging because salmonella seems to be widespread in the environment. So taking a single farm taking action may not be effective. We may need to really consider taking a coordinated approach that considers the ecosystem as a whole. And our work on salmonella and antimicrobial resistance contributes to this growing body of evidence that supports the idea of considering enteric pathogens and AMR as One Health issues, not just human health issues. It's important to note here that One Health is intended to improve the health of multiple species and the environment, not just humans. And I think moving forward, we need to ensure that the actions control disease recognize the importance of all components of the One Health triad. And with that, I will end. Of course, there's a big list of acknowledgements and lots of support. So I really appreciate my colleagues and students and the funding agencies. And I hope I've been able to give you a sense of the role of wildlife in One Health, or at least one of their roles in One Health. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And especially a huge thank you to Professor Karen Kitt, Professor Sibley, Professor Jardine, and Professor Murphy that were so kindly giving us their time to talk about those really important issues. And we have some really good questions coming in, and I will start with some questions for Professor Kidd first. And the first question here that I have in the chat is Canada now making adequate progress in upgrading wastewater treatment, and or more generally, what is Canada actually doing? And I will add on a second one here. If they don't do much, what are the biggest barriers to implement those wastewater management solutions you suggest?
Thank you. I think the biggest initiative is around this wastewater systems effluent regulations that came into force in 2015, and that those regulations are requiring a minimum effluent quality. So they're regulating the effluents for suspended solids and oxygen demanding substances and ammonia and chlorine. And so new plants have to meet those regulations, but existing plants have to upgrade their facilities to meet them. And they have, in some cases, a decade or two to do that. So I think those upgrades will absolutely help with the issue of pharmaceuticals and effluents, like we saw for the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant. And so I'm optimistic that we'll have better surface water quality because of those investments, and they are huge investments. Like the Kitchener wastewater treatment plant is, it was about $340 million to improve the effluent quality. So it's, it takes money and time, but I think we're heading in the right direction. And in terms of barriers, I think one of the big ones is information exchange and knowledge exchange, and bringing Indigenous communities into the discussion so that we have all the stakeholders at the table in undergoing these upgrades, I guess, and monitoring and making sure that the upgrades are having downstream benefits too. So I think it's requiring a more holistic approach to the issues, and sometimes wastewater effluents aren't the big source of phosphorus, for example, to our surface waters. So we need to think too about other stressors like agricultural runoff that Paul talked about. I think I'll stop there because I could go on and on about that too, but thank you.
Well, I think this leads perfectly to Paul, so I'm going to ask Paul the next question. And the first one that I see here is if you had any suggestions on how to use food waste in sustainable intensification practices.
Well, yeah, so food waste is kind of at least two prongs that need to be considered here. One is just reducing food waste as opposed to using it in an intensification situation. We need to focus on mechanisms of reducing that. And, there are a lot of things that you and I can do just on a very, very local basis, even in our own household. Simple things, and I'm thinking on the reduction side here of checking, due dates so things don't spoil very quickly. Or, I find it remarkable. I'm a member of Costco, and I go to do shopping at Costco at the time, and you buy, big items and a lot of it. And we noticed that when we switched to that, we were wasting a lot of food that was going past expiry. We just weren't using it. So we had to be very more judicious about our approach in what we needed at a particular point in time. And if we were going to get it, are we going to use it to make sure that we reduce that waste and so on. It might come as some surprise that as much as 30%, 40% of the food that is actually wasted is wasted at the farm scale. It's not even in the household. A lot of stuff is left on the field and it's never gone to sale because the market might not be there. Maybe there's a slight defect because of a disease or something like that, and it's not marketable because people, demand high quality, blemish-free products and so on and so forth. And of course, you can always, but at least that's plowed back into the soil. So, I mean, it's returning some of those nutrients. It might be wasted in the sense of potential food that would go and feed a population. And we also need to think about supermarkets that are sometimes bound by health laws to throw food away that might be still viable and could go to a local food bank or something like that. So there's lots of ways to deal with the with food waste in terms of minimizing the amount that is currently wasted, which on average is about 30 to 35% of a household. At least in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I am, we have a really outstanding organic recycling program. So waste in the sense that we're not using it, but at least it's not going to a landfill. It's being produced into soil, which I can then go to the local dump site and actually get it to return to my garden that I have in the backyard.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul. So I'll think with that, I will ask a question for Dr. Murphy. I think she can answer this one. And the question we got is asking about if anyone has any experience or if anyone has studied the cause of the constant boil water advisories in Indigenous reserves.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. This was a really good question, and it's a really complicated answer. When I was a postdoctoral fellow before I went and took an academic job in the US, we looked at First Nations communities and looked at data on what were the predictors that led to communities having boil water advisories. And a lot of it came down to the lack of operators, the lack of operator training, lack of transparency around like what operator salary is and consistency around the operators. So it was less on actually the technology. It was more on the operations side. We also saw that there was just lack of transparency on and ownership of the operators on operating their plants. So they might not know what the budget was for chlorine, for example, to be able to plan in advance on how much chlorine they need for their community. There's also concerns with inappropriate placement of treatment systems because they've historically were put in a place that was culturally inappropriate, maybe because that water supply was maybe not, that shouldn't have been used for drinking, for example. So there's been challenges related to the technology not matching kind of the context, also in terms of complexity, and then operator training capacity and retention and valuing water treatment operators in those contexts. And the same applies in small water systems across Canada and North America. Actually, retention of operators and qualified personnel in these small communities is really a challenge.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next question goes to Dr. Jardine. And the question is, could this movement of AMR by wild animals have an impact on the natural resistome, all the antibiotic resistant genes of bacteria in soil environments? Would that be leading to a change in these soil communities? And what could the potential impact be?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I guess one of the things that I would just think about is probably the relative impact. So it seems like perhaps, there might be a bigger impact associated with, sewage water in rivers and from livestock, and that the impact might be larger. But I think it certainly is possible that antimicrobial resistance and the genetic determinants can be transferred between different bacteria. They could end up in the soil. So it is certainly a possibility. And I think it's something that we need to think about. The sort of relative contribution of wildlife, may be debatable, but I think that is probably something that we really need to be thinking about. And one of the things that's really interesting about wildlife is their ability to move quite large distances. So there's a lot of interest in birds as mechanisms for the spread of antimicrobial resistance over very large distances as they migrate. And so that's one way you could imagine, some sort of resistant, some sort of genetic element could end up in a new place that, wouldn't be expected in a way that you wouldn't see with, waterways and that kind of thing. So I think that's a great question. And I think it's something we should definitely be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have another question here for Professor Kidd. And the question was, that you talked in your introduction about aquaculture, which for us from the environmental science side is like a big interesting topic. And the question is, do you have any ideas what the primary concerns are surrounding aquaculture practices from your perspective, and if there are similar concerns in marine and freshwater ecosystems?
So the work that we've been doing around aquaculture operations has been on anti-lousing compounds and their fate in the environment at marine systems, but also the release of nutrients from excess feed and feces from these operations. So we've done work in both freshwater and marine systems, and we see in both cases that when operations are not done efficiently or there's excess feed, you see those nutrients supporting organisms that are living around the pens, so fish and invertebrates. So I think the aquaculture operations are getting better with their operations, because when feed isn't eaten by the fish, that's money lost. So they're bringing in a lot of new technologies to improve fish feeding that I think is minimizing those kinds of impacts. But there is also a move afoot to go and use anti-lousing compounds in a way where there isn't environmental release of them, like so they have baths for the fish, or they're turning to anti-lousing compounds that are much less persistent in the environment, like hydrogen peroxides, for example. So those are the issues I'm most familiar with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question here for Dr. Sibley. And the question is an interesting one that a lot of people are interested in hearing your response, is about who is responsible for getting the ball rolling on the conversion to sustainable practices. Is it expected to be the farmer that starts the change, or should it be coming down from the government or any other office of, I can't say that word, or anyone else? Or like, what do you suggest as to who starts the ball rolling, and which party should it be?
Well, it's not anyone. It's in a sense, and I'll explain because I don't mean this to be a cop-out, it's really everyone. And I'll give you an example. When we were writing our vision for 2050, we realized, and this goes to the heart of the concept that I was talking about, agro-systems. So you need to have the farmer. The farmer, of course, is at the core, but they're so saddled with issues right now with their own concerns. I talked about the economic inviability for a lot of small farming operations. From a One Health standpoint, that creates a lot of mental stress and so on. So to add something else to their plate and say you're responsible for this, of course that's not going to work. What we need is a collective and collaborative effort. The farmer will be at the centerpiece of this because they are the stewards of the land in that sense. But you also need governments, for example, to be very, very involved. Governments have to incentivize farmers to, let's take the example of land setbacks. If farmers can find a way to agree to that, land sharing, land sparing, et cetera, they would need to be compensated for that. And that comes through incentive programs through the government. There's no other way to really incentivize that other than perhaps to label a product coming from that farm as maybe green or something like that. And maybe the consumer can then make a choice, but that becomes a little bit more complicated. It's not undoable. I'll give you another example. Municipalities have a very important role to play here. You could argue that that's also government, but what I mean by that is one of the partners on our vision was the City of Guelph, and they were very interested. In fact, they had submitted their own initial submission to the food prize on the first round, talking about the becoming Canada's first circular economy linked to food production, where food is grown locally, grown regionally, and sold locally. And it had components of reducing food waste, going back to the previous question, and nutritional value of the food and so on. They have to be involved. I would argue that First Nations have to be involved, because one of our partners on the vision as well was a professor from the University of Windsor, and she works directly with the agricultural community, and in particular with Indigenous farmers who are trying to re-engage in the traditional farming practices. And this goes right to the heart of regenerative approaches, because a lot of what they do is regenerative in nature. It's not kind of the industrial agricultural model that they use. So there's a lot of people that have to be engaged here. I haven't listed all of them. And we have groups in Ontario that are doing some of this: the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, the Alternative Land Use Systems Organization. These are all people that we spoke to in developing our vision. So it exists, it's there, but it has to be collaborative. There's no one person. It most certainly can't just be the farmer.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul, for elaborating on that. As we are coming close to the end here, we have one more question that came in from one of our School of Environmental Sciences faculty. That actually is a perfect question to end this, because all of you can talk about it. It's actually highlighting that importance of One Health, and it talks about agriculture and soil health, and it talks about, or it's asking of how in sustainable agriculture we are promoting of introducing animals to the landscape by switching to manure application instead of chemical fertilizers. But of course, when we introduce manure and animals into our agricultural landscapes, that also comes with introducing pathogens and bacteria into soil and waterways. And the question is, does anyone have any comments on what we have to be careful about when we do this switch by integrating animals into our sustainable agricultural practices, considering all of the potential impacts of pathogens and bacteria? And I think I will start the discussion with asking Dr. Jardine to give her perspective on this.
Sure. I think it really shows the complexity and all the things you need to take into account when you think about One Health. Because if you looked at, someone who's really interested in pathogens in wildlife, they might be quite alarmed by this approach, because they think that there could be potentially more exposure to wildlife. But on the other hand, you can see the benefits of doing this kind of thing and reducing chemicals. So I think, from my perspective, it just shows the importance of bringing a variety of different, all the different stakeholders to the table when you're trying to develop these solutions, just so all these things can be considered. It doesn't mean that you won't do it, but maybe we need to find out a bit more about what the impacts are going to be, and how we're going to deal with those impacts. And I think I'll pass it along to Heather. Do you want to take it over?
Sure. Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I think it was a really interesting question. I was writing down notes, and it kind of made me think about when we talk about the multi-barrier approach to protecting water. It's never one thing that is going to ruin a water supply. It's a kind of a cascade of events, like manure application right before a heavy rainfall, for example, in the case of Walkerton. So I think you can do it in a certain way as long as there's control measures in place, and kind of putting my engineer hat on, like you can put in different measures, perhaps to then safeguard at least human health and waterways. And right now we don't know that much about groundwater and how groundwater is becoming contaminated. We know there's lots of different mechanisms, but we don't know which one's the predominant mechanism. And sometimes it's human waste from septic systems, for example, and not always animal waste. So I think there's some controls we can put into place, but if everyone's at the table, like Claire said, and having a conversation, we can decide at what point you apply these regenerative approaches and you time it so that it's maybe not going to impact water supplies, for example. Maybe I'll pass that to Karen to add her thoughts.
Oh, I'm not sure I can. I think you answered the question very eloquently, so I'll pass it. Maybe Paul would like to say something around this question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly agree with a move toward increased use of animal wastes. I would add and include human wastes in that, but that too generates a lot of controversy. I've done a lot of work on biosolids in the context of pharmaceuticals, actually, and uptake into plants, and we see absolutely no risk whatsoever. And yet I've sat in some extremely boisterous town halls in communities who are discussing whether or not a biosolid should be allowed to be applied to their lands. Farmers appreciate it because it's adding nutrients back to the soil. It is regenerative, but there are concerns. Some of those concerns, and Dr. Jardine kind of alluded to this to some extent, in terms of pathogens. For example, I've heard it expressed concerns about prions or prions and Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. But my counter is that there's never been a single documented case in humans from biosolids of a transmission of a prion. There has in wildlife, though, and people say, well, what's the difference? Well, it hasn't yet been documented. Doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. What I will say, and really what is absolutely key, is communicating to the public. And that is that we have in Ontario standards in the case of biosolids, but it's also true in the case of manures. The best standards probably in all of North America. And you could, there are restrictions based on metal content. There's restrictions based on the amount you can apply over a 5-year period, the time that you have to wait once you've applied them, the types of crops to which they can be applied. Very, very restrictive. And if you adhere to those, at least, if you adhere to those, I think we're in good position to say this is a very safe practice. Now, with the concerns over a particular group of chemicals, and kind of like Karen, I could go on at length about this, but the perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFASs for short, they've been cropping up in a lot of jurisdictions. In the state of Michigan, for example, has just banned the practice, or at least some counties, of applying biosolids to the fields because of the occurrence of PFAS. And one of them is linked to cancer. And so there's concerns there. And I guess the idea is that they're just going to ban it outright. But I would say ban it until you understand it, kind of a precautionary approach, if you will. But I think that these sorts of approaches, anything that reduce the reliance on synthetic chemicals, and in conjunction with other practices related to integrated crop management and buffers that allow for the absorption of those nutrients, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of things that we can do, but these are all safe practices, and they are regenerative. And I think it's good. So, there's a lot of elements of One Health in all of this, but communicating to the public is absolutely important, and probably by somebody who knows how to communicate, not somebody like myself who tends to probably use too much technical jargon and maybe doesn't have quite the patience that somebody needs to have. But there are people out there that can do that, and they're very good at it.
Perfect. And I think that is concluding our live virtual Hammond Lecture for this year. And I really want to thank all of you who are in attendance for taking that time to join us, to listen to us, and to share your interest in those really important and difficult topics. And I know we are all getting tired of all of those online meetings, so we really appreciate all of you showing up and then also asking those brilliant questions and showing so much interest and passion for the topics. And then I also want to thank again to all of our speakers and panelists for taking the time to be with us and for sharing their thoughts and knowledge with all of us. I wish you a wonderful evening and take care.